The year 1815 marked the dawn of a new era in England. Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo had secured British dominance across Europe, and London's aristocratic society basked in unprecedented prosperity and influence. Within the marble halls of Mayfair's grandest mansions, dukes and duchesses orchestrated elaborate social seasons that would determine the fate of entire bloodlines for generations to come. The Pemberton dynasty stood as one of England's most illustrious noble families, their lineage tracing back 3 centuries to the court of Elizabeth I. Their ancestral seat, Ravenshollow Manor, dominated the Hampshire countryside like a Gothic cathedral of power and privilege. The estate's imposing facade of honey-colored stone rose 4 stories into the English sky, its countless windows reflecting the morning light like watching eyes that had witnessed centuries of secrets. Within the manor's east wing, an ancient library housed over 10,000 volumes bound in leather and gold, their spines bearing the accumulated knowledge of generations. Towering mahogany shelves reached toward coffered ceilings painted with scenes of classical mythology, while Persian carpets worth more than most estates cushioned the footsteps of those privileged enough to enter this sanctuary of aristocratic learning. Lady Catherine Pemberton, 23 years of age and possessed of striking auburn hair that caught fire in candlelight, moved through the library with the practiced grace of one born to command attention. Her morning dress of ivory silk had been crafted by London's finest modistes, its empire waistline emphasizing her elegant figure while maintaining the strict propriety demanded of unmarried ladies of her station. Pearl earrings inherited from her grandmother caught the light as she turned her head, and her green eyes held an intelligence that both attracted and intimidated the young lords who sought her favor during the social season. This particular morning found Catherine engaged in the tedious task of cataloguing her late father's personal collection, a duty that had fallen to her following the 3rd Duke of Pemberton's unexpected death 3 months prior. Her younger brother Edmund, now the 4th Duke at merely 19, had shown little interest in the family's extensive literary holdings, preferring instead the pursuits of hunting, gambling, and the scandalous adventures that occupied most young noblemen of his generation. As Catherine climbed the rolling ladder to reach a high shelf of philosophical treatises, her fingers brushed against a leather-bound volume that seemed somehow different from its companions. Where other books bore the distinctive Pemberton crest embossed in gold, this tome displayed only worn brown leather marked by decades of handling. Its placement between Locke's essays and Hume's treatises seemed deliberately inconspicuous, as though someone had taken great care to hide it in plain sight. The moment Catherine's fingers closed around the mysterious volume, she felt an inexplicable chill race through her veins. The leather binding felt warm to her touch, almost alive, and when she opened the cover, her breath caught in her throat. Written in elegant copperplate script across the first page were words that would forever alter her understanding of her family's history: the private diary of Margaret Pemberton, 1st Duchess of Pemberton. May God forgive what I have done, and may these words never see the light of day. Catherine's hands trembled as she realized the magnitude of her discovery. Margaret Pemberton had been the legendary founder of their dynasty, the woman whose beauty and cunning had elevated a minor baronet's daughter to become one of the most powerful duchesses in English history. Official family records portrayed Margaret as a paragon of virtue and wisdom, the perfect aristocratic matriarch whose political acumen had secured the Pemberton family's position at court for generations. Yet as Catherine read the first entries of this hidden diary, a very different picture of her ancestor began to emerge. Margaret's own words revealed a woman consumed by ambition, willing to employ deception, manipulation, and even blackmail to achieve her goals. The diary detailed secret meetings with foreign diplomats, clandestine affairs with married noblemen, and most shocking of all, evidence of forged documents that had fraudulently established the family's claim to their ducal title. The library's grandfather clock chimed 10 times, its deep bronze tones echoing through the vast chamber like a warning bell. Catherine knew that within the hour, she would be expected to join her mother, the Dowager Duchess, for their daily review of social correspondence and preparation for the evening's entertainment. The London season was reaching its peak, and the Pemberton family's reputation required constant maintenance through carefully orchestrated appearances at the most prestigious gatherings of the ton. But how could Catherine continue to smile and exchange pleasantries with other members of the aristocracy when she now possessed knowledge that could destroy not only her family's reputation but potentially undermine the very foundations of English noble society? The diary's revelation suggested that many of the most respected families in the realm had built their fortunes on similarly dubious foundations, their noble bloodlines nothing more than elaborate fabrications sustained by collective denial and carefully maintained silence. As Catherine closed the diary and held it against her chest, she felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon her shoulders. The leather binding seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of long-buried secrets, each page containing revelations that could topple governments and destroy lives. She understood instinctively that she stood at a crossroads that would define not only her own future but the fate of everyone she held dear. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside forced Catherine to make a swift decision. She slipped the diary beneath her shawl and descended the ladder with as much composure as she could manage, her mind racing with the implications of what she had discovered. Whatever Margaret Pemberton's sins might have been, they had been buried for nearly 3 centuries. The question that now tormented Catherine was whether some secrets were too dangerous to remain hidden, or too devastating to be revealed. The afternoon sun streamed through the diamond-paned windows of Ravens Hollow Manor's morning room as Catherine attempted to maintain her composure during the Dowager Duchess's daily social briefing. Her mother, Lady Beatrice Pemberton, commanded the room with the austere elegance of a woman who had spent 4 decades perfecting the art of aristocratic intimidation. Her silver hair was arranged in an elaborate chignon that added inches to her already imposing height, and her black mourning dress of finest bombazine served as a constant reminder of the family's recent loss. "The Marquis of Blackthorn has requested permission to call upon you this afternoon," Lady Beatrice announced while reviewing the morning's correspondence through her gold-rimmed spectacles. "His intentions are unmistakably serious, Catherine. The match would be advantageous for both families, uniting 2 of the oldest bloodlines in England." Catherine forced herself to nod appropriately while her thoughts remained consumed by the diary hidden in her chambers. Lord Blackthorn represented everything she had been raised to desire in a husband: wealth, position, and impeccable breeding. Yet knowing what she now knew about the potentially fraudulent nature of noble lineages, the entire concept of aristocratic marriage seemed suddenly absurd, like actors performing an elaborate charade without realizing their costumes were made of tissue paper. Furthermore, the Dowager Duchess continued, "The Duke of Marlborough has invited our family to attend his summer house party at Blenheim Palace. The guest list includes the most influential members of Parliament, several foreign ambassadors, and rumor suggests that even members of the royal family may grace the gathering with their presence. Your brother Edmund's attendance is essential for maintaining our political connections." The mention of politics sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Catherine's chest. If Margaret Pemberton's diary contained accurate information about the family's fraudulent claims to nobility, then their current political influence rested on foundations of sand. The English aristocracy operated on an intricate web of mutual recognition and inherited privilege. If questions arose about one family's legitimacy, the resulting investigation could expose similar deceptions throughout the nobility, potentially triggering a crisis that would reshape British society entirely. A gentle knock interrupted the Dowager Duchess's recitation of social obligations. Morrison, the family's elderly butler who had served 3 generations of Pembertons, entered with the measured dignity that had made him a legendary figure among London's domestic staff. His livery of deep blue wool bore the Pemberton crest embroidered in gold thread, and his white hair was powdered to perfection despite the growing fashion for more natural styles. "Your Grace," Morrison addressed the Dowager Duchess with a bow that managed to convey both respect and subtle authority, "Lord Blackthorn's carriage has arrived. Shall I show his lordship to the blue drawing-room?" Lady Beatrice's expression brightened with the satisfied smile of a general whose strategic plans were proceeding flawlessly. "Indeed, Morrison. Inform his lordship that Lady Catherine will join him momentarily." She turned to her daughter with eyes that brooked no argument. "Remember, my dear, that marriage among our class is not merely a personal matter but a political alliance that affects generations. Your beauty and intelligence are assets to be employed wisely for the benefit of our family's future." Catherine rose from her chair with mechanical obedience, smoothing the skirts of her afternoon dress of pale green silk. The gown had been selected specifically to complement her coloring while projecting an image of refined femininity that would appeal to potential suitors. Its high neckline and long sleeves adhered strictly to the moral standards expected of unmarried ladies, while the subtle embroidery of silver thread hinted at the wealth and taste that would accompany any man fortunate enough to secure her hand in marriage. As Catherine walked through the manor's corridors toward the blue drawing-room, her footsteps echoed against marble floors that had been polished to mirror brightness by generations of servants. The walls displayed portraits of Pemberton ancestors stretching back centuries, their painted eyes seeming to follow her progress with expressions of aristocratic authority. Yet now these same portraits appeared to Catherine like evidence in a criminal proceeding, each face potentially representing another layer of deception in her family's carefully constructed mythology. The blue drawing room earned its name from the exquisite Wedgwood blue silk that covered its walls, complemented by furniture upholstered in complementary shades of ivory and gold. A pianoforte of rosewood occupied one corner, its surface adorned with sheet music for the latest compositions from Vienna and Paris. Fresh flowers from the manor's gardens filled crystal vases throughout the room, their fragrance providing a delicate backdrop for the formal conversations that regularly took place within these walls. Lord Marcus Blackthorne stood with his back to the fireplace as Catherine entered, and she was struck anew by the commanding presence that had made him one of London's most sought-after bachelors. At 32 years of age, he possessed the lean build and confident bearing of a man accustomed to both physical and social conquest. His dark hair was styled in the latest fashion, and his morning coat of navy superfine had been tailored to perfection by Weston, the most exclusive tailor on Savile Row. "Lady Catherine," Lord Blackthorne said, executing a bow that managed to convey both respect and intimate interest, "you grow more lovely with each encounter. The morning light seems particularly flattering to your complexion today." Catherine curtsied gracefully while fighting to suppress the cynical thoughts that Margaret Pemberton's diary had awakened within her mind. How many similar compliments had her ancestor received from men who believed they were courting a legitimate duchess, unaware that they were being manipulated by a woman whose entire identity was built upon lies. "You are most kind, my lord," Catherine replied, settling onto a silk-upholstered settee with the practiced grace that years of deportment lessons had made second nature. "I trust your journey from London was pleasant." Lord Blackthorne took the chair opposite her, his grey eyes studying her face with the intensity of a man accustomed to reading the subtle signals that determine success or failure in both business and romantic pursuits. "The roads were tolerable, though I confess the beauty of Hampshire's countryside paled in comparison to the prospect of spending time in your delightful company." Their conversation continued along the predictable lines of aristocratic courtship, touching upon the weather, mutual acquaintances, and carefully neutral political topics. Yet beneath the surface pleasantries, Catherine found herself analyzing every word and gesture through the lens of her newfound knowledge. Was Lord Blackthorne's interest in her genuine, or was he primarily attracted to the political advantages that marriage to a Pemberton would provide? More disturbing still, was her own family's elevated status nothing more than an elaborate confidence game that had somehow sustained itself for 3 centuries? As Lord Blackthorne described his recent travels to his estates in Yorkshire, Catherine's attention was caught by the arrival of another visitor whose presence would complicate her already turbulent emotional state. Through the drawing-room's tall windows, she observed a vehicle approaching the manor's front entrance, driven by a man whose identity sent her pulse racing despite her determination to remain composed. Captain James Harrington of His Majesty's Navy represented everything that aristocratic society taught young ladies to resist: adventure, uncertainty, and passion that transcended the calculated alliances of the ton. Though the younger son of a respectable baronet, his lack of significant fortune or title made him an unsuitable match for a duke's daughter, regardless of the courage he had displayed during the recent naval campaigns against Napoleon's forces. Yet Catherine had found herself drawn to Captain Harrington's stories of life beyond England's shores, his descriptions of foreign ports and exotic cultures that existed far from the restrictive protocols of noble society. His sun-weathered hand spoke of real work and genuine accomplishment, a stark contrast to the soft fingers of men who had never known labor more strenuous than lifting a wine glass or signing documents prepared by their solicitors. The tension in the blue drawing-room became palpable as Morrison announced Captain Harrington's arrival, creating a social situation that violated numerous unwritten rules of aristocratic propriety. For an unmarried lady to entertain 2 gentlemen simultaneously, particularly when one was an acknowledged suitor of appropriate rank while the other represented a romantic impossibility, bordered on scandalous behavior that could damage reputations throughout London society. Lord Blackthorn's expression darkened with barely concealed displeasure as Captain Harrington entered the room with the confident stride of a man accustomed to command despite his inferior social position. The captain's navy blue uniform bore the salt stains and were marks of genuine service, a stark contrast to the pristine morning coat that proclaimed Lord Blackthorn's status as a gentleman of leisure. The difference between earned distinction and inherited privilege had never been more apparent. "Captain Harrington," Catherine managed, her voice betraying none of the emotional turmoil his presence invariably provoked. "What an unexpected pleasure. I trust your recent voyage to the Mediterranean proceeded successfully." Captain Harrington bowed to both Catherine and Lord Blackthorn with the easy grace of a man equally comfortable in drawing rooms and on storm-tossed quarterdecks. His brown hair bore streaks of premature silver earned through years of naval service, and his blue eyes held depths that spoke of horizons far beyond England's carefully manicured countryside. "Indeed, my lady. HMS Relentless performed admirably during our patrol of Spanish waters. We encountered several merchant vessels flying suspicious flags, though diplomatic considerations prevented us from conducting the thorough investigation such circumstances would normally warrant." His words carried subtle implications about the complex political maneuvering that continued even after Napoleon's defeat. Lord Blackthorn cleared his throat with obvious irritation. "How fascinating, Captain. Though I'm sure Lady Catherine has little interest in the mundane details of naval administration. Perhaps your time would be better spent reporting to the Admiralty rather than troubling ladies with accounts of your professional activities." The insult, delivered with aristocratic precision, hung in the air like smoke from a discharged pistol. Captain Harrington's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his response maintained the perfect courtesy required when addressing one's social superiors. "Your lordship is quite correct that duty calls. However, I come bearing news that may interest Lady Catherine's family. During our recent voyage, we encountered a Spanish merchant captain who claimed possession of certain historical documents that might concern English noble families. The gentleman expressed interest in negotiating their return to their proper owners, though naturally such arrangements would require delicate handling." Catherine felt her blood freeze in her veins. Could there be other documents similar to Margaret Pemberton's diary? The possibility that additional evidence of aristocratic fraud might exist somewhere beyond England's borders added new dimensions to her growing anxiety. If foreign powers possessed information that could expose the illegitimate claims of English noble families, the implications for national security could be staggering. Historical documents? Lord Blackthorn scoffed, though Catherine detected a note of unease beneath his dismissive tone. Spanish merchants are notorious for fabricating elaborate stories to inflate the value of worthless papers. I hardly think such tales merit serious consideration. Captain Harrington's gaze shifted to Catherine, and she saw something in his expression that suggested he understood far more about her current situation than his words revealed. "Perhaps, my lord. Yet sometimes the most valuable treasures are those that powerful men most desperately wish to remain hidden." The Spanish captain spoke specifically of English documents dating to the late 16th and early 17th centuries, precisely the period when many current noble titles were first established. The implications of his statement struck Catherine like a physical blow. If documents from that era had somehow survived in foreign archives, they might contain evidence that could either corroborate or contradict the information hidden within Margaret Pemberton's diary. The prospect of additional revelations about her family's fraudulent origins filled her with simultaneous dread and fascination. Lord Blackthorn rose from his chair with obvious displeasure. "I find this conversation increasingly inappropriate. Lady Catherine, perhaps we might continue our discussion in more private circumstances. Captain Harrington, I'm certain your duties require immediate attention." But Catherine found herself unable to dismiss Captain Harrington so easily. "Actually, my lord, I find the captain's information quite intriguing. Perhaps he would be so kind as to provide additional details about these mysterious documents. Such historical artifacts often prove fascinating to scholars of genealogy." The look that passed between Catherine and Captain Harrington in that moment conveyed volumes of unspoken communication. She saw in his eyes the recognition that her interest extended far beyond academic curiosity, while he seemed to understand that his information had struck some hidden nerve. The connection between them transcended the formal barriers of social protocol, creating an intimacy that made Lord Blackthorn's presence feel intrusive and unwelcome. The Spanish captain mentioned documents bearing seals and signatures that could authenticate or challenge various claims to nobility, Captain Harrington continued, his gaze never leaving Catherine's face. He suggested that certain English families might find such papers either extremely valuable or extremely dangerous, depending upon their contents. Catherine's mind raced with possibilities. If Margaret Pemberton had been involved in widespread deception regarding noble titles, it seemed logical that evidence of such activities might have survived in unexpected places. Spanish merchants and diplomats had maintained extensive correspondence with English nobles throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, creating numerous opportunities for sensitive documents to end up in foreign hands. Where might one locate this Spanish merchant? Catherine asked, her voice carefully controlled despite the urgency she felt. Such historical research could prove valuable to genealogical societies. Lord Blackthorn's patience finally reached its breaking point. Lady Catherine, I must protest the direction of this conversation. These tales of mysterious Spanish merchants and ancient documents sound more like the plot of a Gothic novel than serious discourse. Surely your time would be better spent on more appropriate feminine pursuits. The condescension in his tone triggered a flash of anger that Catherine barely managed to suppress. How dare he assume that her intellectual interests were somehow improper simply because she was a woman? Margaret Pemberton's diary had revealed a woman who manipulated international politics and managed complex financial arrangements with skill that rivaled any man of her era. Catherine found herself wondering if her own capabilities had been artificially constrained by social expectations that had nothing to do with her actual abilities. I find history quite fascinating, my lord, Catherine replied with deceptive mildness. Understanding the past often provides valuable insights into present circumstances. Captain Harrington smiled with obvious approval at her response. Precisely so, my lady. The Spanish merchant mentioned that he would be docking in Portsmouth within the fortnight. Should anyone wish to examine his collection of documents, he expressed willingness to entertain serious inquiries from qualified parties. The implications of his statement were clear. If Catherine wanted to pursue this mysterious collection of historical papers, she would need to find a way to travel to Portsmouth without arousing suspicion from her family or society. Such a journey would be impossible to undertake alone, requiring either deception or the assistance of someone willing to help her navigate the complex social barriers that constrained unmarried ladies of her position. As if reading her thoughts, Captain Harrington added, I would be honored to serve as escort for any serious historical researchers who might wish to examine these documents. My naval connections could provide proper introductions and ensure appropriate security for such delicate negotiations. Lord Blackthorn's face flushed with barely controlled rage. Captain, your suggestions border on the scandalous. Lady Catherine is not some common scholar who might gallivant about the countryside pursuing academic whims. She is a duke's daughter whose reputation must be protected from any hint of impropriety. But Catherine had already made her decision. The mystery of Margaret Pemberton's diary demanded investigation, regardless of social conventions or Lord Blackthorn's disapproval. If additional documents existed that could shed light on her family's true history, she would find a way to examine them, even if doing so required her to violate every rule of aristocratic behavior. 3 days later, Catherine found herself seated in Captain Harrington's vehicle as they traveled the Portsmouth road under the guise of visiting her cousin Elizabeth, who conveniently lived near the naval port. The deception had required careful planning and considerable courage, as discovery would result in social ruin that could destroy not only her own reputation but potentially damage her entire family standing within the ton. The Spanish merchant, Don Carlos Mendoza, proved to be a distinguished gentleman whose silver beard and elegant manner suggested education and refinement rather than the crude commercialism that Lord Blackthorn had predicted. His ship, the Santa Isabella, rode at anchor in Portsmouth Harbour like a floating palace, its carved figurehead and gilded decoration speaking of wealth accumulated through generations of successful trading ventures across the Mediterranean and Atlantic. Lady Catherine, Don Carlos said as he welcomed them aboard his vessel, Captain Harrington has explained your interest in historical documents pertaining to English noble families. I must confess that your beauty and intelligence far exceed his descriptions, though I understand such qualities often accompany the bloodlines of ancient aristocracy. Catherine felt a chill of irony at his words, knowing that her supposed noble bloodline might be nothing more than an elaborate fabrication maintained across centuries. Yet she managed to smile graciously while Captain Harrington helped her navigate the ship's gangway, his strong hands providing both physical support and emotional reassurance as they embarked upon this dangerous investigation. Don Carlos led them to his private cabin, where leather-bound chests lined the walls like a treasure vault from ancient tales. The air carried exotic scents of sandalwood and cinnamon, while sunlight streaming through the stern windows illuminated maps and documents that spoke of voyages to distant continents. Here was a world that existed beyond the rigid boundaries of English society, where knowledge and adventure took precedence over birth and protocol. The documents that may interest you, Don Carlos explained while unlocking an ornate chest bound with brass fittings, came into my family's possession during the reign of your King James I. My ancestor served as unofficial diplomat between the Spanish court and certain English nobles who sought to establish trading agreements that circumvented official government channels. He withdrew a collection of papers wrapped in oiled silk, their preservation remarkable considering their age. As he carefully unfolded the first document, Catherine gasped in recognition. The handwriting was unmistakably that of Margaret Pemberton, though the signature bore a different name entirely, Margaret Huntley, daughter of a minor merchant rather than the aristocratic heiress she had claimed to be. This correspondence, Don Carlos continued, describes a complex scheme to forge genealogical records and purchase noble titles through carefully orchestrated bribes to corrupt court officials. Your ancestor was apparently quite skilled at such arrangements, though she was hardly unique in employing such methods during that particular period of English history. Captain Harrington moved closer to examine the documents, his expression growing increasingly grave as he recognized the implications of what they were discovering. How many families were involved in these deceptions, he asked. Don Carlos smiled sadly. According to these papers, approximately 30% of the noble titles created during the early 17th century involved some degree of fraudulent documentation. The English court needed money to fund foreign wars, while ambitious merchants and minor gentry possessed wealth but lacked social position. The arrangement benefited everyone involved, provided the deceptions remained secret. Catherine felt the foundations of her world crumbling beneath her feet. Not only was her own family's noble status fraudulent, but apparently much of English aristocracy rested upon similar lies. The implications for current political and social structures were staggering, as were the potential consequences if such information became public knowledge. Why have you preserved these documents? Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What purpose do they serve after so many centuries? Don Carlos regarded her with eyes that held centuries of Spanish wisdom and pragmatism. Knowledge is power, my lady, and power must sometimes be exercised to maintain balance. Your English nobles have grown arrogant in their assumed superiority, treating Spanish merchants and diplomats as inferior beings despite their own questionable origins. Perhaps occasional reminders of historical truth serve to maintain proper humility. The threat implicit in his words was unmistakable. These documents could be used as weapons against English aristocracy, either through direct exposure or more subtle forms of blackmail. Catherine realized that her family and dozens of others were potentially vulnerable to foreign manipulation based on historical deceptions that had seemed safely buried for generations. Captain Harrington stepped forward with the protective instincts that had made him a successful naval officer. What would you require to ensure these documents remain private, Don Carlos? Surely some arrangement could be reached that would benefit all parties involved. The Spanish merchant laughed softly. Captain, you mistake my intentions. I have no desire to destroy English noble families or create international incidents. However, I believe certain accommodations might be arranged regarding trade agreements and diplomatic considerations that would benefit both Spanish and English interests. Catherine understood immediately. Don Carlos possessed information that could devastate English aristocracy, but rather than using it for destruction, he sought to leverage it for political and commercial advantage. The documents represented a form of insurance against English arrogance and a tool for ensuring more favorable treatment in future negotiations. Yet as Catherine continued to examine Margaret Pemberton's correspondence, she discovered information that exceeded even her worst fears. Hidden within seemingly innocuous trade discussions were references to ongoing deceptions that extended into the current generation. Not only had Margaret established the fraudulent noble title, but successive generations of Pembertons had continued to manipulate documents and bribe officials to maintain their position. According to the papers, her own father had been involved in forging land records and manipulating inheritance disputes as recently as 10 years ago. The charitable foundations that had enhanced the family's reputation were apparently funded through illegal financial arrangements, while their political influence had been maintained through systematic blackmail of other nobles whose own titles were equally questionable. The revelation struck Catherine like a physical blow. She had been raised to believe in her family's honor and integrity, yet the evidence before her painted a picture of systematic corruption that had continued throughout her entire life. Every privilege she had enjoyed, every advantage that had shaped her education and opportunities, had been built upon lies that grew more elaborate with each passing generation. "There is more," Don Carlos said gently, apparently recognizing the distress his revelations were causing. "According to the most recent correspondence my family received, certain members of the current English government are aware of these historical irregularities. They have chosen to ignore them thus far, but political circumstances could change rapidly if new pressures emerge." Captain Harrington's face darkened with understanding. "You're suggesting that our own government possesses this information and could use it against noble families if circumstances warranted such action?" "Precisely, Captain. Knowledge represents power, and power must always be considered within the context of changing political needs. What seems secure today may become dangerously vulnerable tomorrow, particularly if economic or military pressures require alternative approaches to governance." Catherine felt trapped in a web of deception that extended far beyond her family's individual circumstances. The entire structure of English society appeared to rest upon a foundation of lies that could be exposed or concealed depending upon the political winds of any given moment. Her personal crisis had become a window into much larger forces that operated beyond the comprehension of most citizens. As the afternoon sun began to set over Portsmouth Harbour, Catherine realized that her life had been forever changed by the knowledge she had gained. She could never again participate in aristocratic society with the innocent confidence that had characterized her earlier years. Every conversation, every social interaction, every political discussion would now be filtered through her understanding of the deceptions that sustained the world she had been born to inhabit. The return journey to Ravenshollow Manor passed in contemplative silence as Catherine struggled to process the magnitude of what she had discovered. Captain Harrington maintained his focus on the road ahead, though she could sense his awareness of her emotional turmoil through the subtle tension in his posture and the occasional concerned glances he directed toward her face. The afternoon countryside, with its rolling hills and ancient oak trees, seemed to mock her inner chaos with its appearance of timeless tranquility. As they approached the manor's familiar gates, Catherine felt the weight of impending decisions pressing down upon her consciousness like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. She possessed knowledge that could destroy her family's reputation and potentially destabilize significant portions of English aristocracy, yet she also understood that revealing such information would accomplish nothing positive while causing immeasurable harm to innocent people who had played no role in their ancestors' deceptions. "What will you do with this knowledge?" Captain Harrington asked quietly as they drew near the manor's entrance. His question carried layers of meaning that extended beyond mere curiosity to encompass genuine concern for her welfare and perhaps something deeper that neither of them dared acknowledge openly. Catherine turned to meet his gaze, and in that moment felt the full force of the attraction that had been building between them despite every social barrier that declared such feelings inappropriate. His sun-weathered face bore the marks of genuine experience and hardship, creating a stark contrast to the pampered features of men like Lord Blackthorne who had never known anything more challenging than selecting the proper wine for dinner. "I honestly don't know," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the sound of horses' hooves on gravel. "How does one continue living a life built upon lies once the truth has been revealed? Yet how does one destroy the lives of innocent family members who bear no responsibility for deceptions that occurred centuries before their birth?" Captain Harrington brought the curricle to a halt beneath the towering elm trees that lined the manor's drive, their ancient branches creating a natural cathedral of green shadows that provided momentary privacy from the watching eyes of household servants. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, creating an atmosphere of romantic beauty that seemed almost cruelly inappropriate given the gravity of their situation. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "the question isn't whether to reveal or conceal the truth, but rather how to use this knowledge to create positive change. Your family's wealth and influence could accomplish tremendous good if directed toward worthy purposes. The deceptions of the past might be balanced by genuine service to the future." His words sparked a possibility that hadn't occurred to Catherine during her hours of anguished contemplation. Rather than viewing her family's fraudulent origins as an insurmountable shame, she might consider them as creating an obligation to justify their position through meaningful contributions to society. The Pemberton fortune could fund schools, hospitals, and charitable institutions that would provide tangible benefits to people who possessed no advantages of birth or wealth. Yet even as this possibility took shape in her mind, Catherine understood that pursuing such a path would require her to live with the constant knowledge of her family's deceptive foundations. Every charitable donation, every political influence exercised for positive purposes, would be shadowed by the awareness that their position had been obtained through centuries of systematic fraud. The sound of approaching horsemen interrupted their conversation, and Catherine felt her heart sink as she recognized her brother Edmund's voice calling her name. The young Duke of Pemberton appeared around a bend in the drive, accompanied by two of his friends whose reputations for gambling and debauchery had become legendary throughout London society. Their presence here meant that Catherine's absence had been discovered, potentially creating exactly the kind of scandal she had hoped to avoid. "Catherine!" Edmund called as he spotted the curricle, his voice carrying the imperious tone he had adopted since inheriting their father's title. "Mother has been searching for you everywhere. Lord Blackthorne waited for hours expecting your return, and his patience was severely tested by your mysterious disappearance." Catherine felt Captain Harrington tense beside her as the full implications of the situation became apparent. She had been discovered in the company of an inappropriate companion, traveling without proper chaperonage, and her absence had inconvenienced a suitor whose approval was essential to her family's social standing. By the standards of aristocratic society, her behavior bordered on the scandalous. "Edmund," she replied with as much composure as she could manage, "I was visiting Cousin Elizabeth as planned." Captain Harrington was kind enough to provide escort when his duties permitted such courtesy. Her brother's expression darkened with suspicion as he studied Captain Harrington's uniform and weathered appearance. "Captain, your presence here requires explanation. What business brings a naval officer to escort my sister on social visits?" The challenge in Edmund's voice was unmistakable, and Catherine recognized the dangerous masculine pride that often led to duels and other forms of violent confrontation. Her brother, despite his youth and relative inexperience, possessed the authority of a duke and the hot-headed temperament that had characterized Pemberton men for generations. Captain Harrington dismounted from the curricle with careful deliberation, his movements conveying both respect for Edmund's position and quiet confidence in his own abilities should the situation deteriorate further. "Your Grace, I encountered Lady Catherine at Portsmouth while conducting official naval business. When I learned of her plans to visit relatives in the area, common courtesy demanded that I offer escort and protection during her return journey." "Portsmouth?" Edmund's voice rose with alarm. "Catherine, what possible reason could you have for traveling to Portsmouth? Such a destination is entirely inappropriate for ladies of your station." Catherine felt the walls of deception closing around her as she struggled to maintain her fabricated story while avoiding direct lies that might compound her difficulties. The knowledge of her family's fraudulent origins made every pretense feel hypocritical, yet revealing the truth would create far greater problems than those she currently faced. Cousin Elizabeth had requested certain items that could only be obtained in Portsmouth, Catherine replied, hoping that the vagueness of her explanation might discourage further inquiry. Captain Harrington's presence provided both security and propriety during the journey. Edmund's friends exchanged glances that suggested they found the entire situation highly entertaining. Lords Fitzwilliam and Ashford had built their reputations on their ability to ferret out and disseminate scandalous information throughout London society, and Catherine realized that her predicament might provide them with precisely the sort of gossip that fueled their social influence. How remarkably convenient that a naval captain should happen to be available for such escort duties, Lord Fitzwilliam observed with the tone of a man savoring an excellent wine. One might almost suspect some form of prior arrangement. The insinuation was clear and deeply insulting, suggesting that Catherine had deliberately arranged a clandestine meeting with Captain Harrington under the guise of visiting relatives. Such behavior would brand her as a woman of questionable morals, effectively ending any possibility of an advantageous marriage while bringing shame upon her entire family. Captain Harrington stepped forward with the controlled anger of a man accustomed to command. "Sir, you will refrain from making implications that impugn Lady Catherine's honor. Her behavior has been entirely proper, and I will not permit suggestions to the contrary." The confrontation that Catherine had feared was rapidly approaching reality. Edmund's face flushed with the rage of a man whose family honor had been questioned, while his friends seemed delighted by the prospect of witnessing a dramatic clash between aristocratic privilege and naval authority. The entire situation threatened to spiral beyond control, creating exactly the kind of public scandal that would destroy reputations and potentially lead to violence. Yet as Catherine watched these men posture and threaten each other over questions of honor and propriety, she felt a sudden clarity regarding her own situation. The knowledge of her family's fraudulent origins had freed her from the obligation to respect social conventions that had been established to protect a system built upon lies. If aristocratic society was itself a deception, then its rules held no legitimate authority over her choices. "Gentlemen," she said with a calmness that surprised even herself, "this discussion serves no useful purpose. My actions today were motivated by legitimate concerns, and I will not permit them to be mischaracterized through innuendo or speculation. Captain Harrington has behaved with perfect propriety, and I will not allow his character to be questioned." The authority in her voice seemed to surprise all four men, who had apparently expected her to collapse into feminine distress under their masculine pressure. Instead, Catherine felt a strength that she had never known she possessed, as though Margaret Pemberton's spirit had somehow awakened within her to provide courage in this moment of crisis. The confrontation in the Manor's drive was interrupted by the arrival of Lady Beatrice, whose presence immediately transformed the atmosphere from masculine bluster to respectful deference. The Dowager Duchess approached with the measured steps of a woman accustomed to resolving crises through the application of iron will disguised as feminine grace, her black mourning dress billowing behind her like the robes of judgment itself. "What is the meaning of this commotion?" she demanded, her voice carrying the authority of 4 decades spent managing aristocratic households and the complex personalities that inhabited them. Her gaze swept across the assembled group, noting every detail of posture and expression that might provide clues to the situation she was being called upon to resolve. Edmund immediately straightened his shoulders and adopted the tone of righteous indignation that he had perfected during his years at Oxford. "Mother, Catherine has been gallivanting about the countryside with this naval officer, creating exactly the sort of scandal that could damage our family's reputation throughout London society." Lady Beatrice's eyes fixed upon Captain Harrington with the intensity of a raptor evaluating potential prey. Catherine held her breath, knowing that her mother's response would determine whether this situation could be contained or would explode into the kind of public disgrace that destroyed noble families with devastating efficiency. "Captain," the Dowager Duchess said with deceptive mildness, "please explain your role in my daughter's activities today." Captain Harrington met her gaze without flinching, his naval training having prepared him for interrogations far more intimidating than anything aristocratic society could devise. "Your Grace, I encountered Lady Catherine at Portsmouth while conducting official business. Learning of her plans to return to Hampshire, I offered escort to ensure her safety during the journey." "Portsmouth," Lady Beatrice repeated, her voice carrying undertones that suggested she recognized the significance of that particular destination. "How interesting. Catherine, perhaps you would care to explain what business required your presence in Portsmouth?" Catherine felt the weight of multiple deceptions pressing down upon her consciousness, but the knowledge of her family's fraudulent origins had fundamentally altered her relationship with truth and falsehood. If her entire life had been built upon lies, then perhaps honesty represented the only path toward authentic existence, regardless of the consequences such honesty might produce. "Mother," she said with unexpected steadiness, "I discovered certain historical documents that required investigation. Captain Harrington was kind enough to provide both escort and expertise during my research." The vagueness of her explanation was intentional, designed to provide information without revealing details that could prove dangerous. Yet she saw a recognition flicker in her mother's eyes, suggesting that Lady Beatrice understood far more about the family's circumstances than she had ever revealed to her children. "Historical documents," the Dowager Duchess repeated thoughtfully. "How fascinating. Perhaps we might continue this discussion in more private circumstances. Gentlemen, I'm certain you have pressing engagements that require your attention elsewhere." The dismissal was politely phrased but absolutely final, and Edmund's friends recognized that their entertainment had concluded. They departed with visible reluctance, no doubt planning to share their observations throughout London's social circles within days. The damage to Catherine's reputation had already begun, though its ultimate extent remained to be determined. Once the other men had departed, Lady Beatrice turned to Captain Harrington with an expression that combined evaluation and calculation. "Captain, your assistance to my daughter is appreciated, though the circumstances require clarification. Perhaps you would join us for dinner this evening? We have much to discuss." Catherine felt surprise at her mother's invitation, which seemed to contradict every principle of aristocratic exclusivity that had governed their household throughout her lifetime. Yet she detected something in Lady Beatrice's manner that suggested this crisis had activated long-dormant aspects of her personality, perhaps awakening memories of her own youth when social conventions had seemed less important than genuine emotion. The evening that followed proved to be unlike any dinner that had ever been served at Ravenshollow Manor. Rather than the formal protocol that typically governed aristocratic entertaining, the conversation moved with surprising freedom across topics ranging from naval warfare to historical research to the complex relationships between social position and personal authenticity. Captain Harrington demonstrated a breadth of knowledge and sophistication that gradually won even Edmund's grudging respect, while Lady Beatrice revealed an intelligence and worldly understanding that had been carefully concealed beneath decades of conventional feminine behavior. Catherine began to understand that her mother's life had involved sacrifices and compromises that she had never recognized or appreciated. As the evening progressed, Catherine found herself drawn into increasingly intimate conversation with Captain Harrington, their shared knowledge of the Spanish documents creating a bond that transcended the formal barriers that separated their social positions. She discovered that his understanding of historical and political complexities matched her own growing awareness of the deceptions that shaped aristocratic society. When Edmund excused himself to attend to correspondence, and Lady Beatrice withdrew to review household accounts, Catherine and Captain Harrington found themselves alone in the manor's conservatory, surrounded by exotic plants and flowers that her father had collected during his travels throughout the Mediterranean. The setting provided both beauty and privacy, while the sound of fountains masked their conversation from potential eavesdroppers. "Catherine," Captain Harrington said, using her given name for the first time without the formal address that protocol demanded, "I must speak honestly about feelings that I can no longer contain. My attachment to you extends far beyond the circumstances that brought us together today." His declaration hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything that society had taught her to expect from life. Marriage to Lord Blackthorne would provide security, position, and the approval of everyone whose opinions she had been raised to value. Yet such a union would also represent the ultimate surrender to a system built upon lies, condemning her to a lifetime of maintaining pretenses that she now found unbearable. "James," she replied, savoring the intimacy of using his Christian name, "my feelings toward you have developed in ways that contradict every principle of proper behavior. Yet I can no longer pretend that social conventions matter more than genuine emotion." The kiss that followed seemed to seal their commitment to a future that defied every expectation of their respective positions in society. Catherine felt as though she was finally awakening from a lifetime of dreams to discover possibilities that she had never imagined might exist. Yet even as she surrendered to the passion that had been building between them for months, Catherine understood that their love would require sacrifices that extended far beyond simple social disapproval. If she chose Captain Harrington over Lord Blackthorne, she would effectively abandon the privileges and security that had defined her entire existence, embracing uncertainty and adventure in place of wealth and position. The decision crystallized in her mind with sudden clarity. The knowledge of her family's fraudulent origins had freed her from the obligation to perpetuate a system built upon deception. Rather than using her inherited advantages to maintain lies that had been sustained for centuries, she would employ them to create something genuine and meaningful. 3 months later, Catherine stood in the gardens of Ravenshollow Manor wearing a wedding dress of ivory silk that had been crafted by the finest seamstresses in London. Yet instead of marrying Lord Blackthorne in a ceremony that would have united two of England's most prestigious families, she was pledging her life to Captain Harrington in a celebration that redefined the very concept of aristocratic alliance. The wedding had been planned with careful attention to creating a new model of noble behavior, one that emphasized merit and character over birth and wealth. The guest list included naval officers, scholars, and philanthropists alongside traditional members of the aristocracy, creating a gathering that suggested possibilities for social evolution that had never before been seriously considered. Lady Beatrice had initially opposed the match with all the force of her formidable personality, yet she had gradually come to recognize that Captain Harrington represented qualities of integrity and accomplishment that were rarely found among the pampered sons of noble families. Her eventual acceptance of the marriage had been secured through Catherine's promise to use her inherited wealth for charitable purposes that would honor the Pemberton name through service rather than mere display. Edmund had proven surprisingly supportive once he understood that Catherine's choice would not diminish the family's political influence but might actually enhance it through association with naval heroes and military achievement. The young Duke had begun to recognize that aristocratic survival in the post-Napoleonic era would require adaptation to changing social expectations rather than rigid adherence to traditional forms. As Catherine spoke her wedding vows in the presence of family and friends who represented both old traditions and new possibilities, she felt that she was not only marrying the man she loved but also helping to rewrite the story of what English nobility might become. The deceptions of the past would be balanced by authentic service to the future, creating a legacy that honored both truth and responsibility. The Spanish documents remained safely hidden, their dangerous secrets transformed into motivation for positive change rather than weapons of destruction. Don Carlos had proven as good as his word, using his knowledge to secure favorable trading agreements rather than to damage English families who bore no responsibility for their ancestors' deceptions. Margaret Pemberton's diary found its place in Catherine's private library, serving as a reminder that every generation possessed the power to choose authenticity over deception, service over selfishness, and love over convention. The first Duchess of Pemberton had built the family's fortune through lies and manipulation, but the woman who would become its most honored daughter had chosen to rebuild that legacy upon foundations of truth and genuine achievement. As Captain Harrington, now Captain Sir James Harrington through the knighthood that his naval service had earned, took her hand for their first dance as husband and wife, Catherine felt that she had discovered the secret that had eluded aristocratic society for centuries. True nobility could not be inherited or purchased but must be earned through choices that honored both personal integrity and social responsibility. The lost diary that had threatened to change everything had indeed rewritten history, though not through the exposure of ancient secrets but through the inspiration it provided for creating new possibilities. In choosing love over convention and truth over comfortable lies, Catherine had demonstrated that even the most established traditions could evolve to embrace justice, compassion, and authentic human connection. The future stretched before them like an uncharted ocean, full of challenges and opportunities that would require both courage and wisdom to navigate successfully. Yet Catherine faced that uncertain horizon with confidence born of the knowledge that whatever trials might come, she would meet them as her true self rather than as a character in someone else's elaborate deception. The bells of the manor's chapel rang across the Hampshire countryside, their joyous sound carrying news of a marriage that would be remembered not merely as a romantic triumph but as a watershed moment when English aristocracy began to discover new ways of justifying its existence through service to ideals larger than its own preservation. The diary's secrets had indeed changed the course of a dynasty, though through redemption rather than revelation, love rather than destruction, and hope rather than despair.